Fire! Taking you to cookout, buddy. Welcome back, gamers. Today we're going to be going over one of the latest and surprisingly very effective builds in Destiny with the launch of Season of the Wish. We're going to be breaking down a Solar Hunter build whose sole purpose is to just blow up the world with unlimited ignitions. The footage you have or will be watching on screen is endgame content such as soloing the latest dungeon, Warlord's Ruin, or underleveled content where enemies are very tanky, such as the later levels of the new coil activity, both of which, by the way, get decimated by this build. To kick things off, what is the purpose of the build? What makes it tick? The two main components to this build are going to be both exotics we'll be using today. First, we have Shards of Galanor in our armor slot that has recently been updated to now give huge amounts of super energy back upon defeating either trash mobs or even just hitting big targets such as bosses. A perfect example of this is the Ogre boss in Warlord's Ruin, who, if hit directly, will refund 50% of your energy back. Now, this also works on the yellow bar Scorn, in case you were curious, that are in the dungeon as well. The other benefit Shards has is the knife kills decrease the cooldown of your super, and more on that shortly. The other exotic in our setup is the heavy weapon Dragon's Breath, which is brought back in this season. Dragon's Breath on paper doesn't sound too crazy, but when you start build crafting around it, it becomes a menace and becomes the engine in which we can send out basically unlimited ignitions. To be more specific, Dragon's Breath states igniting nearby targets replenishes fuel, and this weapon refills itself from reserves upon gaining maximum fuel. Also, a small note to add here, all this footage is without the Dragon's Breath catalyst, so if you have that, it only becomes more consistent. So with those exotics in mind, how do you set up the ignition loop? Let's take a look at our kit. First, we have Knife Trick as our melee. When you land a knife attack on an enemy, you scorch them. Additionally, if you kill an enemy with it, you get your melee refunded thanks to our aspects. This is very helpful because, as mentioned before, knife kills decrease the cooldown of your super thanks to Shards of Galanor. Additionally, keep in mind that knife hits make you radiant, which helps us take advantage of a few artifact perks this season, like Kindling Trigger, which lets us scorch enemies with any solar weapon. In this example, I'm using Zuli's Bane, and then Torch allows us to debuff enemies anytime you are radiant with debuff from Strand or Stasis. So for example, I'm using Riptide to apply Chill Clip, but you could substitute this with a Strand weapon, particularly one from the season that has Slice, which gives you a 20% damage reduction from whatever enemy you hit, particularly bosses. Lastly, our knife also debuffs the enemy thanks to Revitalizing Blast, which weakens champions and bosses anytime we hit them with a solar ability. Now, to pair with Knife Trick, we're also going to take Gambler's Dodge in the event that you lose your knife and you need a new charge back, so we can simply just dodge on an enemy to get it. As for jumps and grenades, this is completely player preference, but I would recommend staying on healing grenades for restoration purposes. Moving on to aspects, we have On Your Mark and Knock 'em Down. Both synergize well with this build to allow us to get knife refunds on kill, which we do constantly, and then we have very fast reloads and weapon handling thanks to utilizing a solar weapon in the energy slot. For fragments, nothing is completely set in stone, and you can tinker a bit if you'd like, but this is what I have set up, and it's very consistent. First is Ember of Ashes, which lets us apply more Scorch stacks to targets, extremely helpful for this build. Next is Ember of Singeing, which lets us get our dodges back faster when we scorch targets, which is basically every time we fire our solar weapons. Third is Torches. It allows us to get instant Radiant upon throwing our knife as a target, because why not have another trigger for Radiant? And our last two fragment slots are filled with Ember of Imperium and Solace, which lets us have a bigger timer for both Radiant and Restoration, and gives us the ability to extend the duration of them permanently for as long as we have enemies to shoot at. Before we continue, I want to briefly touch up on the gameplay loop. That'll be a combo of these fragments plus the mod setup, which I will mention in a second. So the loop, essentially, for any boss, will be Dragon's Breath Rocket, followed by a Stasis or Strand shot to get that extra debuff, followed by your knife, which will weaken the enemy, and finally capped off with your super for massive damage, plus a 50% refund, and all while this is happening, your Dragon's Breath will be igniting the enemy. Now, while this loop is happening, you can choose to either shoot the boss with a fusion rifle, like Riptide in my example, which gives you chunks of super energy just for hits, or you can try to get a knife kill off of things around you to get your super back even faster for Blade Barrage. Now, let's move on to the mods. But first, if you're enjoying the build video, please consider subscribing today, maybe leaving a like and or comment as well. It does help the channel grow, is much appreciated, and it helps beat that YouTube algorithm. Now let's get back to the video. So now we're in the mod portion of the build. I do want to note that I will have a dim link in the description below of the video for all of this in case anybody wants to try this out and just copy the mods for yourselves. But for those that don't do dim, here we go. The artifact mods used for this are the following: Blast Radius for when your Dragon's Breath wipes out trash mobs and can give you armor charges, Kindling Trigger, and Torch as mentioned earlier, for Whence You Came due to the season and the dungeon being centered around Taken and Scorn, Flint Trigger just to get another source of Radiant, Revitalizing Blast, like I mentioned earlier, to weaken champs and or bosses, and finally in the last 2 slots for the 5th column, it'll depend on whether or not you're playing solo or with a team. If you're playing solo, you should take Solo Operative because it's a flat 15% increase in all damage anywhere, and then you can take Argent Ordnance for increased rocket damage, given that Dragon's Breath is the key to this build. If you're playing with a team, then you can take Argent Ordnance plus Razor Precision to make things ignite even more via your weapons. For armor mods, in Helmet, I have Hands-On, Heavy Ammo Finder, and Harmonic Siphon. These are to just benefit me getting my super or extra heavy ammo drops. In gloves, you can go with Orb Generation mods and cooldown mods. So in my case, it's Heavy-Handed for my knife kills, and then Impact Induction just for a way to get my healing grenade back faster. In the chest, that's really up to resistance depending on what type of enemy you fight. So, you know, Arc, Solar Void, etc. just depends. And then I would recommend you have a second chest piece ready with Solar Reserves just in case you want to get 10 shots of Dragon's Breath for a boss fight like in the dungeon. Boots are pretty standard, 3 Solar Surge mods for maximum damage, and finally, in class item, we have Time Dilation for the surges, and then Reaper for Orb Generation when you dodge, which will happen non-stop. Also, I should note that Zuli's Bane is not mandatory by any means in your energy slot. You could use other things. There are good solar weapons out there besides this if you happen to not have it, such as BXR from Dares, Vision of Confluence from Vogue, or maybe Callous Mini Tool if you happen to get that from the seasons. Then there's Tyranny of Heaven from Last Wish, maybe Drang, the same season that Callous Mini Tool came from. Maybe you've done Crota a lot recently with it being the latest raid and you got Abyss Defiant. That also could work in that slot. All in all, this build is hella fun, and it gives you the ability to ignite entire rooms non-stop until they are dead, and that includes bosses. I never thought this combo of Shards of Galanor and Dragon's Breath, of all things, was going to be on my bingo card for this season, but here we are, and it's pretty damn good. That's all I got for you guys today. If you have any questions, feel free to ask in the comments. As always, if you enjoyed the video or you like the build, please consider subscribing today and maybe leave me a like and or comment on the channel. It does help the channel grow, is much appreciated, and it helps fight the algorithm. If you don't know what to comment, you can just leave Dragon's Breath as the comment. Otherwise, thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.